Hello and welcome back to Survey of Biology, and today we're going to begin Unit 13 and look at evolution. So what we're going to do is we're going to break it down into 4 parts. And in the first part today, we're going to kind of give you an overview, and then we're going to look at the first part of overpopulation that creates competition for evolution. So let's start with a little bit of a background first. And you may have heard of evolution, have a little bit of an idea of what it is, and we're just going to kind of stick to the science and the process of how populations change over time. And that's what evolution is. So evolution is the change in the gene frequency in a population over time. The two key things here is it's in a population. Individuals don't evolve. So an individual in the population, their genes aren't going to change. And so when we talk about gene frequencies, we can also think of that as their genetic makeup. So the genetic makeup of a population is going to change over time. And so that's the tendency to have certain traits. If you look at the picture here, we have way down in the bottom left, we've kind of got the ancestors, the precursors to modern elephants. And at the very top here, you can see we have Elephas maximus, the Asian elephant, and the Loxodonta africana, the African elephant. And if you look at this chart, you can see how the species has evolved over time. And certain traits have either become more prominent or less prominent. And when you look at this picture, what this shows us is the two most closely related species on here are the two forms of elephants that we have right now. They're at the end of what this diagram called a cladogram is. And so that's what we're going to kind of look at as we go through. So a few definitions. So again, it's the populations that evolve, not the individual. So a population, the definition is a localized group of individuals of the same species at a given time and place. So you, as a Survey of Biology class, could be a population. You are a group of Survey of Biology students that are in the same place, room 219, at the same time on B days. And so when we look at this population, remember it's the genetic makeup or the gene frequencies that are going to be changing. So what we need to look at in a population is, what is the gene pool? So the gene pool is the total alleles, which are forms of a gene. So if you remember when we talked about genetics, there's a gene for blue eyes and there's a gene for brown eyes. Those are different alleles. So I think this will come back to you. But the gene pool is the total alleles in a population at one time. So it's all the different variation that's present. And it's this variation that's critical to help with evolution. So natural selection, this is the kind of the basic idea that you may have heard of before or may have heard of Charles Darwin, his idea of natural selection. So natural selection is the process whereby organisms better adapted to their environment, and I might put in here more adapted to their current environment, tend to survive and produce more offspring. The theory of its action was first fully expounded by Charles Darwin and is now believed to be the main process that brings about evolution. So natural selection is that certain organisms have variation, have mutations that make them better adapted to their current environment. Because of those adaptations, they can better compete for resources. Therefore, they're going to survive and they're going to reproduce more offspring. So here's the 4 steps that we're going to kind of break it down into. So the first step is overproduction. So every species tends to produce more individuals that can survive to maturity. That creates competition for a resource. And then in that population, you're going to have variation. So the individuals of a population that have many characteristics that differ. Some of those variations are going to lead to survival. They're better adapted to their situation, which leads us to step number 3, selection. So some individuals survive longer and reproduce more than others do because of the adaptations they have. And finally, number 4 is adaptation of the population. So over time, the traits of those individuals that survive and reproduce will become more common in a population. So if you look over on the left here, and we'll call this population number 1, and then finally over on the right here, population number 2, the gene frequency, the genetic makeup has changed. The population on the right here has more darker individuals, and that population has evolved because the gene frequency, the genetic makeup, has changed. And so what I want to look at is if we go back real quick and talk about the overpopulation. So let's talk about patterns of growth real quick. So there's two ones that I need you to understand just a little bit. The first one on the left is exponential growth. Sometimes it's called a J curve because it looks like a J. And what happened here is basically we have unlimited growth. That population is rapidly growing. And this is what happens in a population where there's something called high biotic potential, where there's no limiting factors. The population is allowed to reproduce as quickly as it's possible. Over on the right is logistic growth, and this is sometimes called an S curve. And this is a population that has reached something that's called carrying capacity. So that's right here. So that's where the population will level off, and the population doesn't continue to grow because of limiting resources. Right here at the carrying capacity, there's going to be very intense competition because the resources are limited. So just keep in mind as we go forward to how populations can grow, and in specific, remember the J curve. Because what happens is if we look at this kind of dial here, there are things on the left here, the biotic potential that will cause a population to increase. Things like the reproductive rate. Rabbits, mice, insects, fish have a higher reproductive rate than elephants or rhinoceros or humans. Okay. Another thing is the ability to migrate in plants and animals, the ability to invade new habitats, defense mechanisms, things that can protect themselves, camouflage, the ability to cope with adverse conditions. These are all things that are going to increase their biotic potential and their ability to reproduce very, very quickly and look more like the J curve we had talked about. On the right-hand side, here's things that are going to reduce the population. So these things we call environmental resistance. So lack of food or nutrients. So if there's not enough food, the population is going to go down. Lack of water, habitat, adverse weather conditions. If there's more predators, disease, parasites, competitors. So all of these things are going to limit a population and maybe make the population look more like the S curve or logistic growth that we had talked about. Now, how this applies to evolution, the last thing we'll talk about, is this very famous graph by Thomas Malthus, who influenced Darwin very much with this idea. And Malthus's ideas originally were more about human populations. And so they had something called the Malthusian catastrophe. Okay? And what Malthus proposed was that populations increase exponentially. So populations follow that J curve. And unfortunately, food production over here is linear. It does not increase with the population. So at some point where those two cross, you've got something called the Malthusian catastrophe. And that's where the population is growing faster than the food production and people are going to starve. Population could potentially crash. And Darwin said, oh, wow, well, look at this. And he applied it to the greater plant and animal kingdom and said, hey, this can happen in any case. If there's overproduction of individuals compared to resources, food, shelter, water, then there's going to be a place where there's going to be high competition. And so this is what I want you guys to kind of remember and take from this first one, is that the first step in evolution is that there's overproduction of the species. There's more individuals than what the environment can support, and that's going to lead to competition. So I'll leave you with a short cartoon here because if you follow from the first couple slides I had, eat, survive, reproduce. That's kind of what evolution is. And now we're here to think, is that what it's really all about? So we'll continue with evolution shortly after that. So thanks for listening, and we'll see you soon.